Hey bead friends, it's Lauren Harpster from Bead and Blossom. Today we are continuing with my Learn French Beading Intermediate Techniques series. In this series we're going to be learning how to alter and build on top of the techniques that I taught in my beginner course. So I am going to be assuming that you have already worked through the techniques in my beginner course. In this lesson I'll be covering the loopback technique, which makes these feathery little details on the side of a petal or leaf. And I am going to assume that you are familiar with basic frame and lacing, which were taught in my beginner course. Now, I do have an intermediate technique packet PDF that you can download from my website, beadandblossom.com, and I will link in the description below of where you can get a copy of that PDF packet. I am working with a 24 gauge copper core wire and size 11 seed beads. I've already got my basic frame made up through row 7. So I've got a 10 bead basic row, 7 rows, round top, pointed bottom, and we're ready to make our first loop back. Now, the first loop back needs to be made out of 2.5 inches of beads. So I'm going to measure 2.5 inches of beads. Move the rest down. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to, instead of wrapping at the top wire, a loop back is called a loop back because you are looping back towards the bottom wire. So I'm going to bring that working wire back towards the bottom. I'm going to make sure that my row of beads kind of meets up with that bottom wire. And I like to go ahead and pinch these now. Pinch them closed as tightly as you can. Just like a continuous loop, this should not be open and loopy like that. It needs to be tight and pinched close together like so. Now we need a pointed bottom, so I am going to cross over at a 45-degree angle, wrap around the bottom, and then come up. And there is the first loop back. Now we've got this situation here at this bottom wire where we've got 2 rows of beads on the same side of the bottom wire without anything between them. So if I were to just continue on making my next loop back and try to pull those beads up like this, I end up with this little gap between my rows of beads there. So I'm going to teach you guys something here. This was taught to me by Suzanne Stephenson. I call it repositioning the working wire. And it helps to weave your wire up between those rows so that you can eliminate that little gap. Alright, so we need to cut wire off of the spool for this. So we need about 1.5 feet of wire. And whenever a pattern tells you a specific amount of wire to cut, you should always cut a little bit extra, just so you have a little bit of wiggle room. As you may use a little bit more or less wire than the designer did. Alright, so I'm going to straighten out the wire that I just cut off of my spool. That makes it more manageable and easier to work with. And then I'm going to form my wire into a loop that points back towards my work. And then I'm going to take the wire back through the back side of my petal, right between those 2 rows in my first loop back. And then I'm going to pull it all the way through. I'm going to watch the wire as I pull it through to make sure it's not forming any kinks. I'm going to kind of hold my petal right here so that when I pull this wire, it's not going to wonkify my petal. So I'm going to continue pulling all the way through. And now my wire is exiting between those 2 rows of my first loop back instead of underneath them. So I'm going to add about 2.5 inches of beads back onto my wire here. Alright, now the second side of a loop back tends to be a little bit shorter than the first one, so I'm going to add a little bit more than 2.5 inches just so that I have room to adjust if I need to. I didn't need to remove those beads, but okay. I'm going to go back down to the bottom wire. I'm going to pinch my little loop back, and I'm going to look at the height of my loop back compared to this other one. Now, it's a little bit too long, so maybe I didn't need those extra beads this time. Sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't, so I just like to have them on there so I can play around a little bit with the height. And these loop backs should fit right against the side of your petal before you fold them in half. If you've got it out here and then you fold it in half, it might not, that little fold might not be in the right spot. So I tend to kind of mold it around the side of my petal first. and then fold it in half, and that should be about the same height there as the other side. And I can wrap again at a 45-degree angle at the bottom wire. Now on this second loop back, the matching loop back on the second side, we do not have 2 rows of beads on the same side of the bottom wire, so I do not need to reposition that working wire on the second half of my petal. It's only on the first half. So I can go ahead and just start the next loop back without having to weave that wire up. And the next set of loop backs are going to be made out of 2 3/4 inches of beads. So I'm going to add about that many beads to my working wire. I'm going to measure out beads, 2 3/4 inches of beads. And I'm going to remove the excess because I already know I'm going to have to reposition that working wire. All right, I'm going to fold it back to that bottom wire and then kind of pinch and fold that loop back in half. And I'm going to pinch even more right there at the top because I don't want that little open loop in the middle of my petal. And then I can wrap at the bottom wire. And again, because this is the first side of my petal, I do have 2 rows of beads on the same side of that bottom wire, so I do need to reposition my working wire. So again, I'm going to run my fingers along my working wire to straighten it out, and then loop it back towards my work, and insert into the back of the petal right between those 2 rows of beads in that loop back. Grab and hold onto my petal, and pull that wire all the way through. And you do want to pull pretty tightly on that because you want that wrap that you just made to be really tight against the back. And then we can make our last loop back. So we're going to string 2 3/4 inches of beads. String a whole lot more than I needed. I'm going to go a couple beads past so I have room to adjust if I need to. And then I'm going to loop back to the bottom, fold in half, and this time I am going to use those extra beads. I'm going to leave those on there instead of removing them. So I had about 2 extra beads there in my loop back. And then I'm going to wrap at the bottom wire. And because this is our last row of beads, we can double wrap and then remove the working wire off of the spool, or off of my petal. Cut that top wire and fold it back. And then we need 2 bottom wires, so I'm going to twist this down just a little ways and then open up my loop over here on the side. Our last step for this petal is to lace it, so I've got some 30 gauge copper core wire that I folded in half. And the pattern says about a 1/2 inch from the top of the petal and the loop backs. So you can measure it if you want. I usually eyeball it, but it would be about 1/2 inch from the top. So that's where I want my lacing wire to start, is right there. Between those 2 beads, cross those wires on the back. And lacing is a beginner course technique, so I'm not going to demonstrate it in full here. I just kind of want to demonstrate how I lace my little loop backs in. Now notice I'm not going in a straight line because I do have this arc going on with the main part of my petal, and the loop backs kind of makes this little arc. So in order to stay in 1/2 inch from the top, I do kind of need to angle downward, kind of making more of a U shape than a straight line with my lacing wire. Alright, so I'm at the edge of the petal, and to lace my loop backs in, I'm just going to pull it really close against the petal and pinch and hold it together with that row of petal because I want them to sit right beside each other. I'm going to pinch and hold that together with one hand while I lace with the other. I'm going to do the same thing with the next loop back. And make sure that my rows are nice and straight down at the bottom, not bunching up on top of each other. And then just continue lacing straight across. And then at the edge of the petal, I will double wrap that lacing wire, and then I can continue with the other half of my lacing wire to lace the second half. Alright, so once I'm done with that other half, I'm just going to clip my lacing wires right against the back of my petal. And there I have a finished petal with little loopbacks. Alright, one last little tidbit here. The loopback is an add-on technique, and that means that you can use it with any of the base techniques. So I'm going to show you real quick how to do these with continuous loops as your base instead of basic frame. So I've got 25 beads here that I've made into a continuous loop. Now, my working wire, because of the way that I twist my continuous loops, I twist them clockwise, and that makes it so my working wire is coming over the front of this bottom wire pointed towards the right. On a basic frame, my working wire is crossing over the front, pointing towards the left. I'm not entirely sure why I do that. I think it's just more comfortable for me to twist clockwise than counterclockwise. So pay attention to what direction your working wire is going over the front of that bottom wire. If I were to start on the side where my working wire is going around the back instead, you could end up with a little tiny bit of wire here that you can't cover because you can't get those beads on top of that working wire. So when your working wire is crossing over the front, you can easily push your beads down to cover that bottom wire completely. Alright, so I used 25 beads for my starting loop, and I'm going to use 25 beads for my loop back. So I've counted out 25 beads, and I'm going to loop back to the bottom wire. Wrap once. I've got that double, straighten that out there. I've got those double rows of beads on the same side of the bottom wire, so I need to measure and cut wire. Let me check my notes here. About 10 inches is what my notes say for this pattern, so I'm going to measure out about 10 inches. And then I need to reposition my working wire. So I'm going to straighten out my wire to make it more manageable. And bring it up between those two rows of beads. And I'm going to add 25 more beads. Well, probably going to do more than that. Alright, I've strung enough. Because I don't need to reposition after the the matching loop back on the opposite side, I don't need to reposition after this one, so I've got enough beads on here to make this loop back and then the next one as well. So I need 25 beads for this loop back. And make sure that my working wire is pushed all the way down, so that my beads are between those two rows. And then fold in half back towards the bottom wire, pinch that loop back in half, and then wrap at the bottom wire. And I don't have that situation with two rows of beads on the same side of the bottom wire, so I can just continue on making this next loop back, which is also going to be at 25 beads. And loop back to the bottom, pinch, and wrap. Now I'm back on that first side of my loop again, so I do have two rows of beads on the same side of the bottom wire, so I'm going to remove the excess beads from my working wire and reposition the bottom wire. Now this time I'm going to add enough beads to my working wire for this last loop back on this petal and then the starting loop of the next petal. Because I am working continuously, I can make more than one petal on the same length of wire. Okay, that should be fine. Alright, so I'm going to count out 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. And I'm going to make that loop back. And then because this is the last row of the petal, I'm going to double wrap. All right, so there's my first petal, and because I'm working continuously, I can continue on making the next one. Now again, with continuous techniques, in order to determine how much space you need to leave between, you will use this length from your first petal as your guide. So I usually just pull it up right beside or even right on top to judge the distance that I need. And again, 25 beads, fold in half. Oh, it moved. I'm going to move these for a second. I'm gonna, about right there, should be about the height that I need for my second petal. And I just do one full rotation there for that starting loop, and I shrunk it. Okay, a little bit longer. Okay. All right, that's about the height that I need. I'm going to string enough beads for this first little loop back. And I already know I'm going to need to reposition my working wire after this one, so I'm not going to add any extras. Pinch. And wrap. And reposition. Okay, I barely managed to make that last loop back. That is a perfect example of why you should always cut extra wire, because I'm the same person with the same wrapping technique, and I cut exactly 10 inches, and it ended up being just a couple inches short. So, good example there of how you can use just a little bit different wire every time you make something. So always cut extra. But I did manage to fit those in there. Anyways, that's just an example to show how you can make these little loop backs with continuous base techniques. Alrighty, bead friends, that's going to do it for the loop back technique. In my next video, we will be learning about scallops and winged scallops.